Okay, new microphone. Today's topic is going to be a question I get a lot also is how did ancient man or Native Americans make such delicate, thin, or intricate uh, pieces of or tools with just simple materials like antler and bone and hammerstones and stuff? How did they do it? And do I use those techniques? And the short answer is nobody knows and probably not. Okay, so no one really knows exactly how they made it, although, of course, they use a lot of skill. That's pretty obvious. Now, there's a debate on whether or not they were smarter than us. Okay, that's a possibility. They were actually using a higher brain capacity than we have. So even if we tried, we couldn't because we're not as good at it as they were. Or, they just had a lot more practice than we do. Now, there are some of us who have been practicing for years and years and years, and we still can't get that same effect on stone. And there are several problems with flint knapping with natural materials. One is we don't work with them every single day as a matter of life and death. Okay, so we take for granted inferior materials, and we work with those, right? We take it for granted that we just can make an arrowhead or a knife out of whatever we have available, and that's good enough. But back in the day, if you wanted something to last a while, you would try to find a material that is durable or is not going to break down for your application, okay, or break or whatever. So all I can say is, well, I'm going to talk about different topics, but what I can say is to reach that level of expertise here in the modern age and to try to understand how they made those things, we need to become more in tune with our materials and become more in tune with how our brain works and how to develop those kinds of skills. Now, as far as skills go, if we are narrow-minded or pigeonhole ourselves into a certain tradition of working with these tools, we may not ever discover the way that they did make them. If we go too far out in left field and start making assumptions and crazy types of tools and stuff, gadgets and jigs and all that, we may be totally off the mark. Now, in either case, we could stumble upon the truth, and somebody knows somewhere. But to focus in on how they made it, how they made those tools exactly, is going to be difficult, of course. But it's also going to require flint knappers who are going to develop their skill and develop their knowledge of the materials and how they interact. Now, after I've been knapping for a while, I've been knapping for about 11 years now, I can make a flake with just about any tool. I could take a piece of flint and make a flake with a piece of wood, a hammerstone, a piece of antler, or just about anything. As long as it's not a complicated object, I can make it with just about any tool now that I've got experience. But to make stuff like very thin Folsom points or very thin Salutrian blades and stuff like that, and some of the Caddoan blades, like the Sweetwater biface, that requires a very specialized skill. And some of the obsidian blades you find in Central America also. Very specialized skill, very almost miraculous ability to predict the flakes and to create extremely thin or extremely delicate pieces when you have to use extreme force to create those flakes. So I've been trying over the past 11 years, but I focus on many different things, and I figured out there's there's kind of like a rule. You can make a flake with just about anything, but to make specific types of flakes requires a lot of practice And there are several techniques for each type of flake. And I cannot tell you exactly how they make each type of flake. There's little telltale signs on these waste flakes. There's a whole field in lithics where you analyze waste flakes and you can kind of judge what tool was used to remove that flake. But I think in my experience, in almost all cases, each type of flake can be made with more than one tool and with more than one technique. Like a technique is what I mean by that is pressure. Pressure flaking is a technique. Percussion flaking is a technique. A combination of pressure and percussion, like pressure assisted percussion or percussion assisted pressure, is also a technique, and you can combine those. You can combine techniques with jigs. You can lever. You can use a lever to create pressure, right? You can use more than one person to create pressure. Like two people can generate a lot of force on like a pressure flaker if that object that you're napping is held in a device, like a clamp or some sort of void in a piece of wood, and you've got two people pushing on it. It's a lot more powerful than one person, and you can get more than one person on there, and you can scale up the tools and create flakes that seem like would require superhuman strength to produce. Okay, and now that aspect of more than one person working on the same piece has not been explored at all in the literature as far as I can tell, and that is an option that I think was viable. Now I can't do it, but in the future I will try to get a helper or helpers. It's hard to do, I know, but try to get helpers to see what the potential is for more than one person creating a single piece. Okay. As far as natural materials go, like I said, you can use wood, bone, antler, ivory. Although ivory I don't really like very much because it's brittle. It breaks apart unpredictably. Although it can be used for percussion and produce some interesting flakes. My rule is anything can be used for a short flake, but not anything can be used for the long thinning flakes. Okay, almost any technique can be used for short flakes. So in the discussions of flint napping, we're really not talking about short flakes or small flakes. We're talking about the long thinning flakes. That's where most of the questions come in, and most of the advanced techniques and advanced skills come into play. Okay, now there's some materials where it's very difficult to nap, period, and all you can get is short flakes. Even if you are a long flake skilled person, with a bad material you can only get short flakes. Okay, that's not discussed very much in the literature either. They tend to, I mean, I shouldn't say they, archaeologists have a very good knowledge of different techniques, but they don't go over all of them that they know of in their discussions. They tend to focus on certain aspects, certain techniques they think are used because of the analysis of the flakes and the platforms and all that kind of stuff. It gets very involved. But to answer that question, how were they made with these natural materials with such a high degree of skill and all that? No one really knows, right? We have a kind of a good idea, we're getting closer, but no one really knows. And even if they did know exactly on some of these techniques how the flakes were made, we don't know that each and every napper used that technique, because it's obvious that not every napper has the same toolbox or the same tools. They gather different tools according to their liking, and they all wear them down in different ways. They all repair them in different ways. They all have different resources in maintaining their tools. Sometimes they can get antlers, sometimes they can't. So the toolkit is just as much of a function of napping as the techniques themselves. And that's not discussed very much in the literature. They assume the toolkit is the stuff that they find, like little bits of antler or little round stones or hammer stones that have obvious wear on them from napping, and they say, okay, that's the toolkit. Well, it could be. That's the extent of the toolkit, but it could be that it's not. It could be that they had little pieces of copper, like little awls of copper that they can do finish work with. They could have had alligator gar scales that they've traded that maybe look like pendants, and they're in a different collection within that site. They put away those other things that look like non-napping tools in other areas, and they don't include them with the napping toolkit. Alligator gar scales can be used for very intricate napping and creating notches. It is a type of ivory, I think, but it's not like tooth ivory. Tooth ivory is very brittle. Alligator gar scales are actually very nice for flint napping, and stuff like that. So in the comment section, if you want to ask me again specifically what I think might have been used for a certain point type, you can ask me. This is just a general video, a general discussion, and I don't really know. It's my opinion that not everybody or no one really knows. They have good ideas, but they don't really know. And even if they did know and stumble upon the truth, there really isn't any way to prove. Because like I said, different nappers had different toolkits. Even if trained by the same people, they will have different toolkits. Do you know what I mean? Because they might not all have access to the same things at all times. Or they might not, well, they probably didn't get their tools from someone else that created a standardized set for everybody. You know what I mean? So even if they come up with how each flake was made, we don't know exactly what sequence they were made in. We don't know exactly if they all follow the same sequence. They could have shifted the points to someone else, or they could have done it all themselves, or they could have left it for a while, came back. They could have made a bunch all at once. They could have made only one at a time. That kind of stuff is relevant, okay? It might be just subtle, maybe nitpicky type details, but it is part of the operational chain, or chaîne opératoire in French. You can see that in some of these studies. The operational chain is important because you need to know the culture to understand the item, right? I think that's a valid point. And sometimes the culture may be very mobile. Once in a while they'll go and get flint, come back. They may not work it at all times of the year. They may not work it themselves. They might give it to someone else. They may have a culture that has no tool makers at all, and yet they have stone tools in their possession, but they don't make any. Or they're a culture that makes lots of stone tools, but only keeps a few for themselves, and the rest is just for trade, or maybe special occasions, or for burials, or only for certain applications, okay? It varies widely. No one really knows. And if someone tells you that they know, get a little bit skeptical, okay? It's cool to speculate, but if you really want to know, we have to study what we're doing now and see how well it compares to the artifacts that we have, okay? If we can create an artifact using natural materials that looks almost exactly like the original, we got a pretty good idea of how it was made. Maybe not exact, but we got a pretty good idea. Okay, hope that helps.